Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is The Third Eye by Manly P. Hall. An article taken from The All-Seeing Eye, Volume 1, Number 1, May 1923. Third Eye by Manly P. Hall. Bang! The shot sounded through hotel like a clap of thunder in the dead silence of the winter night. A moment later, there came a dull thud as of something falling, and the loose fixtures in the hotel room shook. Then came the soft patter of footsteps in the hallway, a woman's half-broken sob, then all was still again. The sound of the shot aroused everyone in the building. Doors opened and frightened faces appeared in the frames of light. What has happened? Is someone killed? Was it a shot? I don't know, do you? From mouth to mouth, the questions flew across the hallway like wildfire. But on one could be found who seemed in a position to answer them. It was then that, with a tremendous gust of personality, Mr. Jeremiah Johnson, the house detective, appeared upon the scene with a glorious blue-green dressing gown draped over pink-striped pajamas. In one hand, he carried a revolver, while with the other he endeavored to make his scanty attire cover as much ground as possible, not forgetting to brush the nickel-plated star which he fastened conspicuously on the blue-green background of his bizarre attire. "Where did the shot come from?" he demanded in a booming voice as he scuffed his way in bedroom slippers to the center of the hall and gazed around. "That is precisely the information with which we desire you to supply us," answered a distinguished-looking gentleman dressed in an iron-gray Van Dyke and blue nightshirt, as he gave the house detective a careful inspection through gold pince-nez and then vanished in the direction of his wardrobe. The detective looked along the hall at the open doors and startled faces, registering professional poise, and then his eyes fastened themselves upon two portals side by side at the extreme end of the corridor. They were the only two upon the entire floor that had remained closed during the excitement. Many pairs of eyes followed the rather bohemian figure of Jeremiah as he laid his course for these doors. In a second, he was pounding on one of them. He waited a second and knocked again, but no answer sounded from within. He tried the door, but found it locked, so turned his attention to the other. He rapped upon this also, but silence alone rewarded his effort. Trying this one and finding it unfastened, Jeremiah opened the door and stepped inside. The portal screen closed behind his back. About a minute slipped by, although it seemed much longer to the watchers in the hall. Then the door reopened, and the detective stepped out. But it was with a look of horror on his pale and drawn face that Jeremiah Johnson half staggered into the hallway, leaning upon the wall for support. "What was it?" all asked in one breath. "Yes," reiterated the gentleman with the Van Dyke, who had reappeared upon the scene, a necktie and smoking jacket added to his wardrobe. "We would be, much obliged if you would elucidate this perplexing problem." "Murder," muttered the detective, as turning he locked the door with his passkey. "Go back to your rooms, everyone, and remain there until the inspectors arrive." And without further word, Jeremiah Johnson disappeared, a trail of pink and green in the direction of the elevator. "I wonder who the dead person is?" asked a kindly appearing old lady halfway down the hall. "I don't know," came a shrill voice from across, "but I think it's just too romantic for words." Muttered the distinguished gentleman with the Van Dyke as his knees shook together. "Really, if they must murder in this hotel, I would certainly consider it a favor if they would turn on the steam heat first. This is a most undesirable moment for a crime, as no one could cast any light upon the mystery." One by one, the doors closed until the only sound breaking the stillness was a whisper now and then which trickled through some keyhole. An hour later, four very puzzled men stood in the center of the room where the tragedy had occurred. Before them on the floor, illuminated by a reading lamp, lay the dead man fully dressed, with a bullet hole in his back. There were no signs of weapons or apparent motive for the crime. Nothing had been touched in the room, and as usual, the officers could not find the clue upon which to base their further investigations. One of the detectives turned to the hotel inspector. "Have you been able to secure any information concerning the murdered man?" "Very little," replied Johnson. "The name he signed on the hotel register was Professor Amos Martin. I hear he is a scientist and a globe-trotter. I've also gathered from my examination here that he is an author and connected in research work with several well-known universities. He is just back from several years in the Orient. On the table you will find the beginning of the latest book that he was writing. It was to be called The Third Eye, and is apparently of a very scientific nature. He seems to be basing it on some Eastern sacred writings or something of that sort. So far as I have been able to discover, he was not married, has no relatives, and is a long way from his original home. He appears to be well fixed financially and has been in the hotel 3 days short of a month. At the word Orient, the detectives pricked up their ears and looked at each other in a significant way. You say he was just back from the Far East? That is a very important point. Do you know whether there are any Orientals in this neighborhood at the present time, especially stopping at the hotel? Oh, yes. Why didn't I think of it before? There is a Chinaman here who came soon after the professor's arrival, who is supposed to be assisting him in the completion of his great book. He may have been with him last night. Where is his room? Asked one of the detectives. Wait a minute and I'll find out, replied Jeremiah as he slipped quickly from the room. While awaiting the return of the house detective, the other three walked over to the desk upon which lay a great mass of typewritten manuscripts. One of them picked up a sheet and read, "The third eye is a small ductless gland in the brain, known to modern science as the pineal gland. In India, China, Tibet, I have come across great scientists who have so developed this gland, which is much more powerful than the physical eye, that they can see through solid walls and into the very secrets of the human mind." "Humph," muttered the detective, scratching his head. He then took a long breath and continued, "Few people realize the powers which work through this eye when it is awakened. If they did, greater attempts would be made to revivify this partly atrophied organ of cognition. This is only possible, according to those who have awakened this power, through the turning upward of the forces playing through the segments of the spinal canal. These forces dilate the gland, which then becomes a super organ of sense orientation. In the Eastern countries, much time has been spent in the awakening and training of this very important gland, and the purpose of my book is to show the Western world the value of this little-known organ." The detective looked at his companions, then down at the dead man on the floor. A rather peculiar expression playing on his face, then shrugging his shoulders, he held the paper under the light and continued. "There are certain sacrificial powers known to the ancients which the Western world little understands, but these secrets are still in possession of certain priests and Eastern scientists whom I have met during my travels. It is of these mysterious ones that I would write. They are found most frequently in northern India, Burma, and China, and among the lamas of Tibet. They have powers of sight far beyond those of the average individual. Their lives as ascetics and hermits and their self-sacrifices and rigid purification have given them powers over their own being and also over others, which are perfectly uncanny to those unacquainted with the hidden side of human nature and the powers of the universe." "Oh, Tommy rot," laughed the officer as he threw the paper back among its fellows. "Some people are getting dippy over this sort of stuff nowadays, and he looked like a nice, sane, sensible sort of man." And the detectives gazed down on the face of the murdered professor. "But this is the way they all get when they delve into these things. They'll either go insane or get killed or something." At the same instant, the house detective returned, apparently quite excited. "Why," he exclaimed, "it's all clear now. That Chinaman had the room right next to this one. I hear that he spent nearly all of his time with the professor and was here with him up to a late hour last night. There's no use talking, boys. When we get him, there'll be another feather in the cap of this department." Jeremiah brought his fist down on the big table, his excitement registering through the blow and sending the papers of the late professor's book skidding around in mad frenzy on the floor. "My, but I'd like to get my hands on that now." As Jeremiah Johnson expressed the thoughts flooding his innermost soul, there came a soft knock at the door, which the house detective swung open and then stepped back, giving a gasp of amazement. In the doorway stood a tall Chinese, dressed in a long Mandarin gown of sober color but rich in texture. On his massive head was a tiny black cap, while a glorious peacock feather hung down his back. In his hand, he carried a beautiful fan, inlaid with mother of pearl, which was closed and which he used as a pointer. It was his face, however, which caused the amazement and that uncanny feeling which seemed to pour out from him wherever he went. He had the dome and brow of a philosopher, and his eyes, while almond, were wide apart and of such great size and brilliancy that they could be but poorly hidden by the dark shell-rimmed glasses that he wore. Under his drooping moustache, his mouth was fixed in a true Oriental smile, a pleasant but absolutely blank expression, which hinted many things but never committed itself. He spoke in a soft, purring voice, English worthy of a college-bred man. "My honorable friend expresses a desire to see me, so I take great pleasure in coming. It is an honor to have important persons such as house detectives, and you worthy gentlemen of the police desire my presence." Some way the thought came into the detectives' minds that this Oriental was deliberately ridiculing them. But his tone was so exemplary, and his manner so polite that there was no chance of taking offense. Even though Jeremiah fancied he saw the upper lip of the Chinaman quiver slightly at times, although this might have been only his imagination. "Are you, sir?" asked the hotel inspector, in as sharp and brisk a tone as he could, with a sense of a certain personal discomfort and an inexplainable feeling of smallness which had crept over him since the entrance of this gifted Chinese. The Oriental bowed low. "Ah, the honorable gentleman has taken the pains to learn my unworthy name. So much attention overwhelms me, and I can only reply by saying that I shall pray to my ancestors for your eternal salvation and the extension of your labors." "Save your prayers for yourself," muttered the detective. "I believe you're going to need them worse than I do in the near future." "Ah, most honorable gentleman, refuse not the prayers of thy lowly servant." And the Chinese bowed again. "For in my country, prayers returned are often needed by those who give them back." At the same instant, his eyes fell on the murdered man for the first time. "Ah!" he exclaimed, and the almond eyes became mere slits. "Murdered?" He turned to the detective. "Oh, so many times I have warned him to be more careful and told him what the immortal Confucius, the giver of all wisdom, said, but it was of no avail, it seems." "Of what did you warn him?" The Chinese tapped his jade thumb ring with his fan and, bowing low, took the liberty of picking a small white thread from the inspector's coat sleeve before making a reply. "Oh, only this, that he had certain weaknesses of which I was aware, and I've told him often that someday these little indiscretions would most likely cost him his life, and—" The Chinese twisted his foot and gazed at the toe of it as it protruded from his Mandarin cape. "And," he repeated, smiling blandly, "it appears to have done so." Muttered one of the detectives. "So our deceased client was subject to indiscretions?" He turned to the Chinese and bowed sarcastically. "Will you please be a little more explicit?" The Chinese merely shrugged his arched shoulders and with long, slender fingers picked up a sheet of paper from the table. It was the title page of the professor's book. "I should advise my honored friends of the detective force to secure a copy of this most esteemed work, should the gods decree that it ever be finished. For I am seriously afraid that this useful organ is not properly developed in the brain of our most worthy friend, the hotel inspector." The detectives looked at each other, not quite sure how to act with this Oriental, who it now seemed was also slightly unbalanced. But as they themselves had nothing to work on in the form of information, they mentally decided that they could not be any worse off, so concluded to allow the Chinese to go on. "Do you know who murdered him?" demanded all in one voice of the Chinese. "No, no, no," answered the Oriental as he opened his glorious fan to blow away some of the smoke from Jeremiah's none too select cigar. "But I think I can find out for you if you wish me to do so." The detectives looked at each other, and then one of them spoke. "Go on, but remember, whatever you say here will be used against you." "Oh, I don't think so," replied the Oriental. "For this is a matter between honorable friends, and as gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to forget what I have said when I go. In fact, to make this easier, I shall even assist you in the forgetting." The Oriental walked to the center of the room, and removing his black cap with its glorious peacock feather, he hunched his shoulders and bent his back, until the dome of his massive head was pointing directly at the dead man. The officers then saw that the top part of his head was shaven clean for a piece about the size of a silver dollar, and that on this spot a small green snake was traced in dark pigment. With his eyes closed and the crown of his head pointing first in this way and then in that, the Chinese noiselessly slipped about the room and finally spoke in his soft, musical voice. "It was precisely as I feared. A lady called upon the professor, my esteemed friend, last evening. How many times have I warned my worthy brother of letters, even going to the extremity of presenting him with a beautiful book of Proverbs by Lao Tzu, and underlining in red those pertaining to his indiscretions. It was not the first visit of the fair lady, but she had married and came to tell the professor that their friendship was at an end. My honorable friend was so unwise, he could not understand the warning that I gave him, although I have prayed to my ancestors to preserve him. He and the lady had a little misunderstanding. Shall we say, there was a slight struggle which would not have occurred had he been a Chinese gentleman. My worthy friend, losing his temper, knocked the lady down with undue expression of Western energy, unpardonable in the East, and turned his back. Now it seems that the lady's husband, being out a great deal of the time, had loaned her one of his revolvers to be used in case of burglars or other emergency. She had brought this with her, and when my unfortunate friend turned his back, she shot him, and dropping the revolver with a scream, ran from the room. That's a very pretty story, muttered one of the detectives, but you forget one thing, please. Where's the gun? It is still in the room, answered the Chinese, and the Oriental turned his head first in a general circle which he steadily decreased in size until it stopped on Jeremiah Johnson, the house detective. The revolver is in the upper pocket of this gentleman's coat where he has hidden it. He concealed it because upon entering the room for the first time, he recognized it as the one he had given his wife. The hotel inspector collapsed. "How did you know?" he gasped. The Chinese bowed himself towards the door, the smile still playing around his mouth. "I should advise our friends, the honorable detectives, to carefully read that little book of Tommy Rot, which my belated friend will not now be able to complete upon the interesting subject of the third eye." He slowly closed the door, saying as he passed out, "I do not think any of you will use the information I have given you against me, but should that be your intention, I can only pray to my fathers for assistance." The four detectives stood alone, blank expressions on their faces. "What happened?" asked Jeremiah Johnson as he looked down at the revolver in his hand. "I don't know," replied the other three. "Say, was that Mishkin here or not?" "I don't know." "Then where did the gun come from? Whose is it?" The oldest of the four detectives scratched his head and turned to the other three. "What have we been doing this last half hour? It seems like I've been asleep. I can't remember anything." "It is the same with me," answered one after the other in turn. They looked down upon the dead man, and there upon the ground beside him lay the title page of his book. In the meantime, the Chinese, his hands crossed in his sleeves, shuffled slowly down the corridor, his face set in the placid satisfaction of the Oriental. I really do hope that these honored gentlemen will not use anything that I have said against me. In fact, I very much believe they will not be able to do so, for my good brothers in the Western world have short memories on problems of this nature. Poor Professor, if he had only developed that third eye a little himself, he might have been spared by the gods to complete that honorable work. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.